The program committee has held several Friday dates for last-minute scheduling. Kind of scary, but it's worked out beautifully, and this is one of them. On July 11th, representatives from 24 Oregon cities and 3 counties met as the Metro Policy Advisory Committee. They were led by Portland City Council Commissioner Charlie Hales, and they agreed that they would confront the expected growth in our region by honoring the regional urban growth boundary and grow up instead of out. This imposition of growth management may be unique in the United States. Charlie Hales is eminently well qualified to tell us how this growth management is to be accomplished and what it will make our region look like. He came to Portland City Council in 1992 after spending 8 years as staff vice president for the Home Builders Association of Metropolitan Portland. His present bureau assignments, lots of them, include transportation, parks and recreation, planning, and neighborhood associations, a genuinely full plate. Charlie's education was at the University of Virginia, but his eyes and talents have been focused on Oregon since 1979. We welcome Charlie Hales to our podium today to discuss these very recent plans for Portland and for Oregon's future. Commissioner Hales.
Well, thank you, Fran, and good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate this invitation. I think the institution of the Friday Surprise to be able for you to address topics that are current right now is a smart idea, and I appreciate being able to take advantage of that flexibility in your schedule to talk about something that is very current today. It's also a pleasure for me to be back before this forum in this room. This forum and this room hold a lot of pleasant memories for me. In my own political campaign for this office, there was a very critical City Club debate that was held in this room, and where, probably inspired by my proximity to Ray Polani, I fired off a wisecrack about riding the bus. That remark not only considerably narrowed my transportation options for commuting to City Hall, good thing I like riding the bus, I'm stuck with it now, but also got people to pay attention to who I was and what I had to say, and this forum provided me that opportunity. It's also with that spirit of homecoming that I come here to report back to you on the work that I and this group of elected officials and citizens from around the region are doing on all of our constituents' behalf to try to navigate towards a more livable future across a tide of growth and change. You all know the challenge that we face. Since I first spoke to the City Club that day in 1992, our region's population has grown by more than 100,000 people. Now, you also have heard during that time some eloquent testimony about the need to meet that growth with effective planning and a healthy civic life. You've heard from our mayor, Vera Katz, in her State of the City address about these issues. You've heard from Metro Executive Mike Burton and John Fregonesi. And I'd like to pause for a moment and recognize them because they're both here. Mike and John, would you please stand? It is because we have capable and visionary elected officials at Metro, both on the council and in the executive's chair, and because we have highly competent staff there that we've been able to do this work. And the fact that we have those assets is a critical strength for us in dealing with these issues. You've also highlighted the theme here in the City Club of rebuilding a sense of community, and we're also motivated by that objective in our work at Metro. But you know in our bones that this is a great place, a community still worthy of that word, but it is at risk. We believe that in order to keep what we love about this place, we must make some difficult changes. We must begin to do regionally what we might in the past have been content to do in Portland alone. Most of the new housing, most of the new jobs, most of the land that's still available for development is not here in the city, though there is real opportunity here. Most of that is happening in the 23 other cities which surround us and in unincorporated areas of those 3 counties. If good planning happens here, but not out there, we will all pay the price of dirty air, clogged freeways, and the dispiriting sameness of sprawl spread across more and more of our landscape. That's the big picture. The growth is upon us, good planning is our only hope, and that the real battle will be waged at the edge of our metropolitan area. And so we in Portland might wonder, is there anybody out there beyond the Portland city limits who sees these things and who's willing to do something? And I'm here to say that fortunately there are elected officials and civic leaders and citizen activists in those other jurisdictions who get it. I'm here to tell you about what some of them are up to and about this remarkable committee with the unremarkable acronym of MPAC and the foundation that this committee has built for a livable region. I'll give you a sketch of the recommendations that we are making to the Metro Council and which their Growth Management Committee holds a hearing on Monday. I'll give you a glimpse of how we came to consensus about those recommendations. And finally, I'll speculate a little about what the Portland metropolitan community might look like and live like if these ideas are put into place. Now, remember that we're here because the voters of this region did something wonderful. They passed a home rule charter for Metro. They gave Metro legal status and a mandate to do regional planning and to have the tools and the authority to make that planning stick. And within that charter was created this Metro Policy Advisory Committee, a body of citizens and elected officials there to advise Metro. And on these planning issues, this committee essentially acts as Metro's planning commission. It's our job at this committee to assemble the ideas, make the proposals, and put them in front of the executive and the council for their action. And so we've done that and written the first chapters of this regional land use plan that's also required by the charter. This is not optional. This is something that the voters said must be done when they passed the charter. Our committee has recommended 8 major changes. First, as Fran mentioned, that we believe we should accommodate expected growth over the next 20 years within the current urban growth boundary, and to do that by assigning what we've called a livable share of that growth to each jurisdiction. Now that share may be livable, but it won't be reached easily. It will require a stretch in every jurisdiction. For example, in the city of Portland, that will mean accommodating 150,600 more people inside the city limits of Portland. It will mean the same thing, accommodating in the same area 32,000 people in Beaverton. Within the city limits of Troutdale, 8,071. Within the city limits of Forest Grove, 6,119. This is a stretch, but we believe it can be done, and we've tried to paint some ways for how we can get there from here. Now, it might be tempting to hear numbers like that and say, stop, we don't want that amount of population growth coming. But we believe also that that growth is coming. And of course, it isn't all people who've arrived here from elsewhere, mea culpa, and many of you as well. It's also our kids. There's a lot of this growth is due to natural increase. In fact, more than a third of it is due to natural increase. So we are accommodating our own children and our own families and our own neighbors when we do this. The second recommendation is to limit, not just downtown, but all over the metropolitan area, the amount of land to be consumed by parking. There is today in the Portland area about 850,000 parking spaces. There are 850,000 parking spaces spread all over the metropolitan area. About 550,000 of those are in parking lots and garages rather than along the side of some street. That's consuming an amount of land of about 5,000 acres, equal to the size of this entire city of West Lynn, every square foot of it. That's a lot of land. We've proposed that we reduce the impact of parking in the future by getting rid of or reducing required parking minimums. A lot of jurisdictions have ordinances that say you must provide at least this many spaces, and we're saying make that less. Right now, buildings average about a quarter of the surface area of many projects, with parking lots taking up the rest. We're saying let's bump that up. Let's have buildings take be about half the size of the surrounding parking lots. Well, that's not a radical change, but it is a change that'll have a lot of impact. Not just in the number of acres, by the way, but where those acres are located. Parking lots are often along the main boulevards or in the most intensely developed areas of each community. So land that you free up for development there is twice as valuable regionally as land out on the edge. Our third recommendation is to guarantee water quality and supply and deal with protection of streams and wildlife habitat as a region. This, like a lot of our recommendations, I think, is an incorporation of common sense. Streams, wildlife corridors, critical natural areas don't know municipal boundaries. The lines on the map mean nothing to water. And so we should deal regionally with that reality, and that's our third recommendation. Fourth, we believe that we should hold industrial and employment areas for industry and employment, and not sacrifice them to megastores like Costco and Walmart and other big box development. We don't want to squander the regional asset of areas where we want to create industrial and manufacturing and distribution jobs by having them consumed by single-purpose big retail buildings. And so we've said in our recommendations every jurisdiction in the metropolitan area should enforce that policy. Next, we've said that we should work all over the metropolitan area for a better mixture of transportation choices. Sure, there are areas now where you can walk or ride a bike or take transit or drive your car, but not enough of them. And we say that that diversity of transportation choices should be more universal throughout the Portland area. And here's the kicker. We say spend money in the future, not on counting cars and finding the worst congestion. Spend money first improving that split of how people can choose to travel. It's the practice in engineering in the past has been to direct the resources to where the worst congestion is. We're saying you have to deal with congestion, but first deal with this question of what transportation planners call mode split. How many different modes of transportation are available to people, and put your efforts first at improving that. Next, we've said, and particularly with the urging of Portland City Commissioner Gretchen Kafuri, who is one of my colleagues on the MPAC committee, that affordable housing must be a shared responsibility of the whole Portland metropolitan area, not just parts of it, not just a housing authority here and there, but every jurisdiction needs to attend to this need for affordable housing. Again, a lot of this is about choices. We are saying there should be more choices for people living in the rapidly growing parts of the metropolitan area than $250,000 single-family homes and 300-unit garden apartments. There ought to be more choices. In fact, our population doesn't come in two sizes, neither should our housing stock, and that no jurisdiction in the metropolitan area is exempt from the need to deal with that. Finally, our last recommendation is that Metro should use its regional planning authority fully. That is, it should use its ability to withhold transportation funds from jurisdictions that don't comply. We have bared the teeth of this document in that last recommendation and said, yes, we mean it. We want the Metro Council and the Metro Executive to enforce these policies. And I think, frankly, we are doing them and the region a service by doing this, because here again we have 24 local governments, 24 cities, 3 counties represented at that table, and citizens saying to Metro, please regulate us, rather than having Metro try to do that unilaterally. So that's the substance of what we've recommended. Now, there have been other regional plans here, and there are other regional plans elsewhere in the country. But this one is different because it has that real muscle that I described. And it also has a very high level of acceptance among the people from around the region that have worked on it. And that's what I want to talk about next. That is, how is it possible that this diverse group of citizens and elected officials from all over the metro area, from the big city and the smaller cities and the communities at the edge of our metropolitan area, could agree on something like this? Was this an aberration? Or can we hope that this is the first step in a shared journey toward a better future? Well, I say it's not an aberration. It's something more solid than that, and that if we think about what it means to be an Oregonian, we can see some shared Oregon values behind this slightly radical set of proposals. We all believe in the beauty of this land. It's something that we brag about, that motivates us, that inspires us each morning when we see the sun rising over Mount Hood. We care about this place, and that's something that motivated our work. We all believe, whether you're in Oregon City or Forest Grove or Fairview Village, that we live in settlements of value and that we want to create places here that are memorable and livable. And that's not something that's limited to people in the city of Portland. It's something you hear from all over the metropolitan area. And I think we've believed in this state from the beginning that you get a better future by planning for it. After all, the pioneers would have hardly gotten here without good planning. And I think somehow that lesson has stuck with us. Secondly, I think it's not an aberration because we do have a tradition in this state of bold leadership. Churchill said once that large views always triumph over small ideas, and I think we as Oregonians believe that. We like the big idea. We like the bold proposal, and if it makes some sense at all, we'll take a chance on it. And we've had effective leaders like Oswald West and Tom McCall and Neil Goldschmidt who've held up that lamp and said, let's try this way. And to our credit, we've followed that kind of leadership often enough that this state is someplace to brag about. We don't just see that from elected officials, though. We see it from citizens. One of the most memorable occasions in recent history on the City Council in Portland was when Elizabeth Unsher Groff, the president of the Woodstock Neighborhood Association, came in to promote her neighborhood plan. This is a fairly routine event because we're doing a lot of neighborhood plans around the city of Portland. And Elizabeth came in and said that this plan that they'd carried out voluntarily had been a little bit of a struggle for her neighborhood. And she said this, she said, we looked around and we saw all the pressures of growth and change, and we thought, well, maybe we could spend our time and energy as a neighborhood association fighting inappropriate development. Or we could instead use our time and energy to try to direct change to our purposes, to use the force of growth and change to improve our neighborhood, and that was the path that we chose. Well, I think she captured the spirit that we hear from our citizens who are working on these issues. We want to use growth to turn the tide to our purposes. I think it's also not an aberration because our work at this committee grew out of the peculiar politics of planning here, politics that were created by the construction of the Metro Charter, but also by some traditions. We practice here the politics of agreement rather than the politics of polarization. I've been told that the Portland City Council is boring a lot lately because we don't have the kinds of fights that may have been common in the past and certainly are common on city councils elsewhere. I understand it in Chicago they have to keep putting screws in the furniture to hold it to the floor because it's much more of an active spectator sport than public deliberation here. We're pretty polite. And we also still believe in town hall democracy. We've believed that since the early days as well, when Joe Meek down in the field at Charbonneau held up the American flag and said, all who are for the Union, on this side. And in an orderly way, they decided to join the Union. And that's a tradition of town hall democracy that Metro has carried on by having MPAC, by having community forums all over the Metro area, by trying to include people in these difficult questions. There's also some politics of agreement at work in how we did our work at the committee. We had many, many meetings in producing these recommendations. There was an incident, for example, where we were working on this question of parking policy, and Gussie McRobert, the mayor of Gresham, was fierce about this. Those of you who know Gussie know that she can be a real table pounder in her effort to be a change agent, and that's healthy on our committee, and she was pounding the table about the need for this regional parking policy. A couple of her colleagues, Lou Ogden, the mayor of Tualatin, Rob Drake, the mayor of Beaverton, were nervous about this because they knew in their jurisdictions that they're very automobile dependent today and that it would be very difficult to operate without enough parking to serve the commerce that's going on there now. And they worked on that issue. They worked on that issue. John said once that it was like trying on a suit many times to see if it would fit, and finally we altered it to the point that it was still a good suit, but it fit. And they accepted it. And that patient consensus building is an Oregon tradition and something that fortunately happened in this committee. There's also an interesting dynamic at work in our deliberations in that there was some peer pressure here. There was some effort to do the right thing in sight of one's peers. So when Gussie pounded the table like that about parking ratios, everyone else had to kind of look at each other and say, well, I guess she's right. I guess we better try to do that. When Gretchen Kafori said, housing is everybody's responsibility, no one could gainsay that. No one could say, well, it's not mine. So the expectation got raised. When City Club member Jim Zirin, who is a citizen member of the committee, said, look, as a lawyer, I've got to tell you, we've got to make these enforcement provisions very clear. If we mean it, we should say it. And we all had to look at one another and say, well, I guess we do mean it, so we better write it so it will stick. Probably the best incident that illustrates this spirit of comity and of compromise on our committee was the last night, the last vote on our recommendations, when Judy Hammerstad, a Clackamas County Commissioner, felt uncomfortable with the housing allocations. She thought that this was too great of a load for her community. She was concerned about the amount of redevelopment that we were assuming, and she voted no on the vote to assign these numbers to each of the jurisdictions around the region. And then a few minutes later, she made the motion, which passed unanimously, to approve the whole package of 8 recommendations, signaling us that she was willing to be bound by the collective effort rather than walk away from the table. No one walked away from the table in this work. Well, next I might spend a couple of minutes trying to sketch what the Portland region might look like in 2017 if these ideas take root. How much will we have to change our current lifestyles? What will our area look like and live like? First, I think we should expect to see a region of vibrant cities. In Portland, we should expect the River District to the north of us to go from diagrams and hopes to a real urban neighborhood with 5,000 homes and apartment units and new neighborhood parks, places to shop, places to walk, places to meet, and a connection between city neighborhoods and the river. We should expect the same kind of new city neighborhood in the area south of River Place. Some call it North Macadam, others call it South Side, but it should have a name. It should be a real place with an extension of the River Place Esplanade with a real street grid and a new neighborhood that people can identify with. Our main streets in the city of Portland, Alberta Street, Belmont, Hawthorne, Martin Luther King Boulevard, Cully Boulevard, should be lined with life and commerce and activity, not just for a few hours each day, but for a lot longer. Our park system in Portland will pass a great milestone. We have about 9,500 acres in our park system today. Sometime in the next few years, on the way to this goal, we should pass that 10,000 acre mark, and we should have a good party when we do. And there should be new parks in Portland, not just in the River District, but elsewhere. And there should be new connections built between the public open space that we have today. It should be possible, long before this plan date runs out in 2017, to start at the Selwood Bridge on the east side, walk across the river, get on the riverfront trail, and go uninterrupted. It's very interrupted today, those of you who use it know, all the way to the Steel Bridge, and then cross over to the east side and walk all the way back to Selwood on a public trail. And then from there, maybe after a little rest, walk all the way to Gresham on the Springwater Corridor. It should be possible to do that in a few years. Not just in Portland, by the way, because, for example, in Gresham, they have a hope for 125 miles of trails and 1,000 acres of open space, and we should realize that goal as well. And in Gresham, you should see not just the 3 new mixed-use buildings that are proposed in their downtown today. Mixed-use buildings are just that, where there's retail and housing or retail and office. Something they said wouldn't happen in Gresham. There are 3 of them in their permit center for applications today. Well, we should see not just those 3, but a lot more. And their new civic neighborhood that's now on the drawing boards should have commerce and offices and 800 homes and apartments and places for seniors and families to live. In Beaverton, Mayor Rob Drake's dream of a strongly defined downtown should be real by then. We should see 4 to 7-story buildings clustered around the transit stations in Beaverton, again with a mixture of office and housing and retail. We should see new urban villages at those stations instead of just car lots. And you should be able to get on commuter rail at Merlo Station and go all the way to Wilsonville. Outside of the urban growth boundary, despite the growth of Sandy and Canby and Newburgh and Scappoose, you should still see real farmland and real forests. Out there, we should still be growing wine grapes and filberts and hay instead of survey stakes and for sale signs. Our urban growth management strategy that we've put before the Metro Council saves 26,000 acres by 2017. That means avoiding adding 3 more Beavertons or 2 more Greshams or 2¼ more Hillsboroughs to our metropolitan area. Now, there will be a lot that hasn't changed, not just outside the urban growth boundary. And I think people fear a lot of this talk about regional planning because they assume that every square foot of the Portland area is going to redevelop. Not true. 70% of the metro area that's in stable neighborhoods today really isn't going to change very much. And the public open spaces, Laurelhurst Park and Forest Park, are still going to be there. They're going to be bigger if I have my say about it, particularly in Forest Park. And in fact, Metro is already helping us make that happen there. But the solid single-family neighborhoods that are the core of our livability today will still be there, and they will still be solid single-family neighborhoods. But there will be more neighborhoods that have a name, and that's part of the objective for what we're building here. I coined a term which got some laughter around my office. I said they should meet the orange juice test. You should be able to send out your middle schooler and have them go get a container of orange juice and get back alive and without the orange juice having completely melted. Maybe that wasn't a good enough term. Maybe in the Portland area we should have used the microbrew test and had it keyed towards adults. But you see what I mean. And in fact, that's again what we're trying to do in many cases, is just apply common sense to development and planning. Mayor McRobert encountered a citizen on the street the other day in Gresham, an elderly woman who was part of a pioneer family that had originally settled Gresham. And this lady came up to Gussie and said, "You know, Gussie, you're on the right track. I like how these new townhouses and apartments are getting built down along Main Street downtown, but you won't have finished the job till we have a grocery store back here in downtown Gresham." Well, she understood what we're talking about. And I don't think that's an unreasonable goal, that a neighborhood ought to have a grocery store. Another thing you ought to be able to do if these ideas take root, you ought to be able to go out for a bicycle ride in more parts of the area without first putting the rack on the back of the car in order to get to someplace safe enough to ride a bicycle. Downtown, there ought to be 3 or 4 new major office towers, more retail. Half of the 65 surface parking lots in downtown should have grown buildings by 2017. And the traditional downtowns in the rest of the metro area, not just Beaverton and Gresham, but Hillsborough and Tualatin, Lake Oswego and Milwaukee, they should have reinforced what's good and healthy about those as urban places. And places that never quite made it before as urban places, Cornelius and Fairview, will be real communities with real centers. Rick Holt and Charlie Haw will have a lot of imitators by then, because Fairview Village won't have just been a pilot project, it'll have been a great success, and others will be racing to catch up with their lead. It'll still be possible, another indicator like the orange juice test, to get out of town in 15 or 20 minutes and you pick blueberries, the blueberry test. And it should still be possible to enjoy the quiet luxury of walking through a silent forest with only a short drive out of town, or maybe just a short bus ride to Forest Park. These 8 recommendations to allocate a challenging but doable share of housing and population all over the region, and to make that stick, by the way, with a minimum density policy that says if it's zoned for this many units, make at least 80% of that actually happen, to limit the land consumed by parking lots, to safeguard both our natural resources and the critical asset of industrial and employment land, to work for affordable housing and transportation choices throughout the region, and to back up these policies with real authority. These recommendations will allow us to accommodate thousands of new residents and practice a more intelligent and sustainable pattern of development, allow us to look better and live better than disorganized sprawl, and thus avoid the need for an immediate expansion of the urban growth boundary. The way this came about was by a carefully built consensus of a diverse cross-section of our diverse region, and I think it bodes well for the next stages of this bold venture in regional planning. What we as citizens in the metropolitan area might get is not just a few remnants of what we love about this place today, but something even better. We might just get a community where more parts of the metro area really have a sense of place and lasting value. There are places in Portland that need that kind of work as well. And in part of the spirit of our work on the MPAC committee was the understanding that although Portland has in many cases taken the lead on these issues, we've made a lot of mistakes in the past as well. We have areas in our city that developed pretty haphazardly, and we've got miles to go before we can say that Gateway, which we've zoned to be a real urban neighborhood, is one. And there are lots of places like Gateway in our own community where we have lots of work to do. So I and my colleagues on the Portland City Council will be rolling up our sleeves, just as Gussie and Rob and Lou and the other mayors and commissioners and council members who serve on MPAC will have to be doing in theirs. We face a lot of challenges as elected officials and all of us as citizens, but I think that Oregonians have a way of responding to those challenges. Now, there are some who will doubt our resolve and our ability to achieve success in this. They have doubted that citizens would pay to protect open spaces and parklands, and they were wrong. They've doubted that citizens would empower regional government with real planning authority, and they were wrong. They doubted that governments could come together and accept tough mutual growth goals, and they were wrong again. Those doubts can be replaced by hope and resolve and success. And they need to be replaced soon because the naysayers are already there. They're already pressuring the Metro Council to water down our recommendations. They're pressuring them to expand the urban growth boundary now and make the changes later. They're pressuring them to go ahead and let 50, 60, 70,000 square foot retail boxes sprout in our industrial areas. They're pressuring now for California-style development. We had a run-in with someone who was proposing that kind of development here in Portland recently. Gated entries, walls around it, no public streets. And in an argument with someone in my office, this very irate developer at one point said, "Well, how would you like it if someone walked past your house?" Exactly. There are some folks who don't get it, and they are exercising their political prerogatives just as well as those who do. And we and our elected Metro Council and Executive must have the courage to build on these ideas and build a better future for our community rather than water these ideas down. Abraham Lincoln said once that the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise to the occasion. As our case is new, we must think anew and act anew. And our challenges, though not as great as his, I think require that same spirit. This committee of citizens and elected officials has begun that work of thinking anew and acting anew for our common future. But the stakes are very high. I hope that in the next year, the resolve that our committee has shown in drafting these first parts of Metro's plan will be continued and reinforced. And when we've finished our work and seen the final document adopted by the Metro Council, I hope that we'll all be able to say that we have a plan that will assure that this is today in our time and will be tomorrow in our grandchildren's time the best of places. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie, very much. I'm delighted to see that your group has gone along with many of the recommendations of the urban growth study that was approved by the City Club. So you're going the right direction. One of the things that was a recommendation in that particular study had to do with not just top-down planning, but bottom-up planning, that there should be very active involvement at the neighborhood level, because it's the neighborhoods where the buildings are coming in and where these changes are taking place. It was clear that there needed to be this bottom-up involvement, but that the question of bottom involvement is difficult in terms of needing a lot of technical support. And so I was wondering what your committee, or perhaps in your role in Portland, is doing to provide that kind of technical assistance at the neighborhood level so that the bottom-up planning can take place.
Very good point, Carolyn. It has been our experience in Portland and in other jurisdictions that are doing this, that neighborhood planning is an expensive and intensive process, and there's really no substitute for it. You really can't do this top down. But frankly, people are busy. It's hard to get them to come to meetings where you're conceptualizing about these issues. When they come to the meetings, we've learned by experience, is when you propose to rezone their property. And then they come. And if you're ready, if your neighborhood planning program is really set up to have an honest and open debate about how do we in my neighborhood accommodate our share of this growth in order to accomplish these things together, to avoid moving the urban growth boundary, to have a better neighborhood commercial district like Woodstock saw. If you give people that opportunity, we've seen them rise to the occasion. We just did a series of neighborhood plans in outer southeast Portland, in the David Douglas School District, Park Rose, Centennial, Reynolds, the eastern edge of the city from I-205 out, those neighborhoods there, 13 neighborhoods. And we saw people who, frankly, a lot of them were not happy about having been annexed to the city of Portland, and were not happy about having had sewers imposed on them by the state and put in by the city, but who nevertheless came to the meetings and said, well, let's go to work. And those people stepped up and took their share of growth. And we have neighborhoods out there like Centennial and Hazelwood and Mill Park who have accepted pretty significant increases in development potential in their neighborhoods. But they wanted to say about it. They said, we'll take a lot more housing around those light rail stations if you give us design review. We said, fair enough. I think that's a reasonable point. So the result of all that process in terms of Metro's calculation, we increased the yield of that land by 14,000 housing units. 14,000 more homes and apartments and row houses can be built in those neighborhoods than could be built before. It would not have happened if those folks had not had a year to work with us. So one of the things the local governments have to do is step up and be prepared to spend real time and real money and real effort in working with their citizens. Otherwise, I think this will blow up in people's faces. Questions?
Andrew Kaiser, City Club member. To avoid a California-esque or an East Coast-esque approach to development in Portland, how do you see the issue to automobiles? Is the concept that there's no place to park, people will not drive? Or are we looking at other alternatives such as disincentives either through taxes or through automobile costs in terms of avoiding the use of the automobile?
I guess the philosophy that I bring to that, and I think our city does, and I think a lot of the folks that have been involved in these discussions, like at the MPAC discussion about parking ratios, is not that the automobile is evil. You know, it is a tool. It is a good tool, and there are many needs for that tool in many parts of the metropolitan area, even the most urban parts of the metropolitan area. But if you design and plan for choices, just as I mentioned in housing, if you design an area where it's possible to walk to the grocery store, where it's possible to go buy a quart of milk without burning a quart of gasoline, you know, if it's possible to carry out some of the activities of daily life without using your car, people will. I like to walk. Most people like to walk. And what we found, for example, in downtown Portland, speaking of parking ratios, along the park blocks we have a series of apartments. We required a minimum of 1 parking space per unit. Those apartments are being managed at about 0.8 spaces per unit. There are people there who have a parking space available to them who've chosen not to buy a car. Well, that's an extreme example. There aren't going to be very many places in the metro area, but my goodness, if we could get housing down to typically owning 1 or 1.5 cars instead of 2 or 3 cars, it would have a huge impact. And a lot of this is that kind of work at the margins. It means reducing the average single-family lot size from 8,000 square feet to 6,000 square feet. Not a radical change, an incremental change. But if you make those incremental changes in a big enough area, it has a big impact. Yes.
Marie Morgan, City Club member. This is a bit of a Goldie Hawn question because I really don't know the answer to this. I've noticed that here in this room today there's primarily a white audience, and I'm really curious to know, have the residents of North and near Northeast Portland been involved in this process, felt they have had access to this process that you've described?
Good question. Well, the City of Portland jumped the gun in that we started our community planning program before the metro planning process really got started. And we did the second of our big community plans. The first one was the downtown plan, or the central city plan. The second was the Albina community plan, which covered the neighborhoods along MLK in North and Northeast Portland. And we had very intensive involvement of folks in those neighborhoods in this process. So we had that kind of bottom-up grassroots process. And really the proof is now starting to show up. Yes, we did a good community-based planning process, but look at the new investment that's happening along MLK and Alberta Street. You know, Terrell Brandon, the basketball star, chose not to put his money in the stock market, but to build a speculative building on Alberta Street. The Albina Community Bank is going to be organized this week. There are new businesses owned by African American business people who've been hoping for years to have a strong neighborhood there to base their business in. The city built the Walnut Park precinct there and opened up a lot of retail space around the edge, and it's leased up and full with new businesses from the community. So I think we have a success story there, and I think you're right. We have to practice the politics of inclusion, not just the people that will show up always at meetings about planning, but to get more people involved. And that's, again, requires active effort and sincerity from the people in each jurisdiction. Yes?
Yes, Dick Anderson, City Club member. It seems like a lot of people have difficulty conceptualizing what this will look like. But there are a lot of public facilities that are built, for example, correctional facilities, police stations, parks, libraries. Do you think it's important for the public sector to lead the private sector in what this new development would look like?
I do believe that, yes. And the public sector has not always walked its talk. There are certainly public facilities that don't meet these standards. Fortunately, we now have enough private developments. The city has participated financially in a number of housing and other neighborhood projects over the last year, and now we can take people, instead of showing them a rendering of what a mixed-use building might look at, we can take them to the old Carnation Dairy, the Belmont Dairy project on Belmont Street, and show them the Zupan's Market on the ground floor and the apartments over top and the row houses on the next block. We can show them real housing. We can show them the row houses that Host built along North Williams Avenue across the street from Dawson Park and say, that's what good designed infill looks like. We can take them to Fairview Village and say, this is what a new community looks like. Now we can take people by the shoulders and put them in front of these projects instead of just talking about it. And the public sector, again, has to design intelligently. We are building, for example, a new police precinct in East Portland at 106th and Cherry Blossom Street, and along the frontage of that police precinct will be, I think, 8 or 10 new row house units, a mixed-use project, probably the safest place to live in town. Across the street will be a new recreation building at Floyd Light Middle School that we're doing in cooperation with the David Douglas School District. So there's going to be another example there of building a real urban place by collaborative effort. So you're right, the public sector needs to walk its talk, and we have to show people real examples where they can walk around and open the kitchen cabinets and imagine themselves living there. Ray.
Ray Plani, City Club member. You mentioned before riding the bus, and obviously riding the bus is a challenge. It takes a lot of time. In many places it doesn't go. Outside of Portland, there's no Saturday, no Sunday, very little evening service. And it should have been expanding vigorously. Metro is expecting that, but it isn't happening. What's going on? We don't have a lot of time for TriMet to get going.
That's right. I appreciate that point, and in fact, among the stories I didn't tell, I'll add a couple quickly here, and that is, even though everyone's still at the table, and even though we're working together, there have been moments of tension in this process. One of those moments of tension is between all of us, not just the City of Portland, but especially the other jurisdictions in TriMet. That TriMet has to be committed to not only the expansion of the rail system, but the expansion of the bus system region-wide, or this won't work. In the Outer Southeast Community Plan, we have rezoned areas with the assumption of higher transit. And if the higher level of transit doesn't come, we've done those residents a disservice. We also had a moment of tension like that between MPAC and the Port of Portland about whether or not we're going to have light rail to the airport. We, on our committee, I think almost unanimously believe that we should, and soon. And Mike Thorne, to his credit, has stepped up to that challenge and is now working actively with others in the region to make that happen. So it hasn't happened yet, it isn't financed yet, but we've certainly raised the visibility of that issue and had some tension with the port about whether or not we would be doing this. So I hope our committee can act as a bully pulpit and a prod for some of those issues as well. Yes,
Ed Marks, City Club member and builder and developer. I have worked in the City of Portland for 25 years. I've had a lot of experience with land development and development-related issues, as you know.
Yes.
And one of the things that springs to mind when we talk about density and neighborhood associations is that neighborhood associations are almost universally, steadfastly, 100% opposed to higher density. So neighborhood associations by themselves are great. I believe in them, and I like the idea and the approach and the sense of community and the rest of it. But if we're going to achieve our density, we need some way of moderating their influence, at least in that area.
Well, Ed, I want to challenge that statement, because I think saying that neighborhood associations are all opposed to growth is like saying all developers don't
Density.
care. I know, okay, not all opposed to density. It's like saying that developers don't care about the neighborhoods that they build in. You know, I know you do, because you built a house across the street from where I used to live on Irving Street that looks like it's always been there, and you did a great job, and you should be praised for that, not just here, but in the marketplace. But it's the same thing is true of neighborhood associations. If they are met halfway, like you met the residents of my street that way, they respond pretty well. And let me give you another physical example. At the corner of 15th and Weidler, is under construction today, is a 202-unit apartment project built by Earl Downs across the street from single-family homes and a church in the Sullivan's Gulch neighborhood, the folks that took Fred Meyer to the Supreme Court. These aren't not pussycats here. And Earl Downs went to them with his architect and a blank piece of paper and said, I'm planning to build an apartment project up here at the corner. I'd like to work with you on some design issues. What would be your concerns? And they said, well, we'd like it to step down to the neighborhood. We'd like a Multnomah Street to be able to walk through, even if it's not a street. And he and OTAC, his designer, were able to meet their concerns on a design basis, and it required a zone change. So it actually ended up in front of the city council. Usually in permits, as you know, it doesn't get to us, but it required a zone change, the mother of all land use decisions. And it had to come, it was a 15-minute love fest in front of our city council, where the Sullivan's Gulch Neighborhood Association, arm in arm with this developer, said, this is a good project, and this is the way the development approval process ought to work. Now, all the stories aren't going to end that happily or that swiftly, but I think we are seeing in Portland that if you give people a real say over the neighborhood plan, and again, that's expensive and slow and intensive, but if you give people that say, and then you follow that plan, and you give people design review in places where it's warranted, then they will, by and large, accept that kind of density. But it has to be on those terms. It can't just be, sorry, your neighborhood's going to change in ways you don't like, but we're going to save the urban growth boundary. That's not good enough for people. But if they're met that way, I think they'll respond positively. Yes, sir.
Hi, Charlie. Urban Mandela City Club member. As you know, I'm a downtown resident and rather concerned about what happens downtown. There are a couple of aspects of what you said that I am a little confused about. You spoke about limiting parking, and in the future, by 2017, having at least half of the downtown parking lots, surface lots, disappear, growing buildings. And yet you were a member of the city council that lifted the parking lid downtown, which can essentially leave unlimited parking for downtown. I do hope we're not going to be faced with 21-story parking garages in order to resolve this contradiction.
Mm-hmm. Good point. No, there will be more parking downtown. We need to get used to that. But there will also be a lot more development downtown. And I know the case of a particular garage where you spent some time in front of our council was a very controversial one. And I want to go back to the statement I just made to Ed. I believe that part of the contract between us as elected officials and all of the citizens that we serve, developers, neighborhood activists, everybody else, is when you plan for something, you ought to be able to do it. And of course, that means that there are places in downtown Portland that are zoned CX, our highest intensity zoning, that will grow parking garages. Others, I hope, will grow new retail and new housing and new office buildings. But there's going to be that kind of growth. But we have to be able to stick to that bargain, that what is in the plan that you helped develop as citizens is something that we will follow assiduously and not just throw away at the first political pressure on either side, either pressure to not build it or pressure to build it where it isn't appropriate. Jim.
Jim Francisconi, City Club member. Charlie, in your committee, was there much discussion about the issue of no job growth in the city and all the job growth in the suburbs and the effect that that will have on land use, transportation, economic consequences. And if there was some discussion, were there some strategies about how to improve the job growth in the city itself?
Good point. Yes, we've been creating an average of about 150 new jobs downtown each year for the last 5 years. There have been some folks leaving and some other folks arriving, and it's been very tepid job growth downtown. And I think the attitude of the rest of the region that shows up at the MPAC committee is on both the question of how much housing can we take and how much employment can we generate is really show me, Portland, show me that you're going to be able to do this. And the Central City 2000 committee that the mayor just appointed and who just reported to us and who have just reported to the Metro Council, I think have done a very credible job of a step-by-step strategy of how do you make downtown really grow and blossom and provide 75,000 new jobs over the next 20 years. That's a huge increase over the rate that we're seeing now. And they, again, the mayor tasked that group with that strategy and made it even tougher, said for each thing that you recommend, tell us how we should pay for it. And they met that challenge, and Bob Ridgely and that committee who did that work, I think, did a fine job and gave us the specific strategy so that we're credible on this question of a pretty spectacular increase in the rate of growth downtown. Now, downtown growth has a lot going for it in this market. We are really seeing robust activity downtown, so it's not science fiction to say that this should happen. And of course, from a regional standpoint, downtown growth is so much more efficient than growth on the edges. The roads, the water lines, the sewer lines, the transit is already here, and we don't have to expand it to serve one of those surface parking lots. So there's a lot going for that kind of growth if we can make it happen. Mike.
Mike Burton, City Club member. I want to thank you and all members of MPAC for the incredible, not only the amount of time, but the quality of the work you put into this recommendation. This is a really tough question. You got to think outside of this for a minute, Charlie, but can you tell me where the Sea of Tranquility is located?
On the moon.
All right.
And I know where Bosnia is, too.
When I walked in here today, a staffer from the City Club asked me that same question, and because I answered that question correctly also, I have been volunteered along with Fran to serve on this challenge with the Vancouver High School students, so I hope you'll be there to join us with that. It'll be helpful.
Thank you, Mike. Well, you know, that might be more fun than an MPAC meeting. I might just take you up on that. I was one of those people who got through college math requirements by taking sailboat navigation and astronomy, so that was an easy question for me. Don't ask me a real math question. Yes.
Kurt Wabering, City Club. I have a question about billboards, which is a detail of urban growth and quality. As you know, the City Club is doing a study. The City Council will be facing a decision in September about billboards, and I'm wondering if you could explain that issue and what your position is for Portland, and also what your position would be or recommendation to other communities in the region.
First, with respect to Portland, I've supported the effort that David Knowles is managing of having a citizen task force work with the sign companies and all the interests of this question and try to come up with a new regulatory regimen for Portland. We've had a 10-year agreement with the major billboard companies that came out of a lawsuit that basically said, our sign code doesn't matter, here's what you have to operate under. Well, I think philosophically, just as I do on these planning issues, that signs should be regulated by code, not some special deal or contract with individual companies. So I hope we can get to that point. As to what our policy should be, I think I'd like to see a lot less billboards. I'd love to see an environment where we have none. With all due respect to the billboard companies, I think the aesthetics of an intense urban environment matter. You know, whether there's green here, whether there's street trees along the streetscape, whether it's an inviting place to live, matters even more when we live more closely together than if we have plenty of room to spread out. So I think there should be less and less place in that environment for clutter. And unfortunately, billboards often act as clutter. So I hope we can get to a process of gradual elimination of billboards in the urban environment in the metropolitan area. And I hope with your assistance and the assistance of those folks on that committee, we can find a way to do that. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all very much. Thanks, Brian.
We want to thank Commissioner Hales for this timely and surprisingly informative Friday program, a wonderful Friday surprise. And I know I include all of you in thanking him for his Portland and Oregon chauvinism and for his kindness in coming and talking with us today. We stand adjourned. Thank you.